All right, my name is Celeste Scott, and I'm an extension agent with the University of Tennessee in Madison County. And today I'm going to be going over one of the modules from the Tennessee Smart Yards program. We're going to be talking about reduce, reuse, and recycling. Okay, so today we are covering the 7th module, Reduce, Reuse, Recycle. You have likely gone through some of these previous modules already, and we just want to reinforce the fact that in order to create a sustainable yard or landscape in general, particularly one that focuses on protecting our state's streams and rivers, we need to employ an entire toolbox of practices. And in this session, our attention is going to be focused on the 3R principle: reduce, reuse, and recycle. So we all know this mantra, and let's just quickly review some examples on how we can reduce, reuse, and recycle in our home landscapes. As far as reducing goes, this talks about, stopping waste before it even starts. We can rent or borrow items that will only be used a few times. You can buy materials in bulk to reduce packaging, like mulch, topsoil, things like that nature. Shop at secondhand stores. Bring your own shopping bags when you go to the grocery store. Some examples of how we can reuse to keep things out of the landfill and keep money in our pockets would be to reinvest in reusable containers like, Tupperware, coffee mugs, water bottles. Let's use, you could use real plates instead of plastic or disposable plates. And even rechargeable batteries, could be somewhere where we could make a few changes in our daily lifestyles. To recycling. Neat fact, according to the EPA, 75% of Americans' trash can be recycled, but only 25% of it actually is. So, for example, aluminum, recycling any aluminum can takes 90% less energy than creating a brand new one. Of course, paper, and the list goes on. So, as with all of our Tennessee Smart Yards modules, we are inching towards success, right? So we're going to cover 4 inches in this module. The first one is where we're going to spend most of our time today. We're going to talk about compost. We're going to cover what is compost, how to compost, and how it can benefit us in our environments. So what is compost? This can mean different things to different people. To a gardener, compost is that rich black gold that we love to incorporate into our gardens to add that rich organic matter back to the soil, which is so essential for soil health. And to others, especially chemists, it could just be a combination of nitrogen and carbon products that have decomposed and nothing more. But let's address what composting is and its resulting products. So first of all, composting is simply taking a process that Mother Nature already does on her own, and she does it quite well. So decomposition, or the process of microbes and other organisms breaking down leaves and other organics and placing it in a more controlled set of conditions to create a product that we can readily use in our gardens in a manageable time frame. And even though Mother Nature does this wonderfully on her own, there are some things that we can do to help the process along. So we can provide some controlled environments and required sets of conditions as far as heat and moisture, airflow go, that will help us to manage our compost piles and make the decomposition process a little more efficient. So now I want to talk a little bit about why would we even want to compost, right? So soil is precious, and geologically it takes a very, very long time for us to create new topsoil if any of that is lost through erosion. If any of that is lost through erosion or other moving of soil. So in fact, it takes an average of 500 to 1,000 years to form an inch of topsoil. Sources vary, of course, on how many years it takes to build that inch of soil, because it's very dependent upon the geology of the area, weather, and all these variable factors. But composting is an environmentally conscientious way to help us build that soil at a little bit faster rate than normally would happen in nature. Second of all, organic media of compost provides a very rich environment for host organisms that aid in the breakdown of organic compounds and release of nutrients that's needed by plants. Third of all, it improves your soil's water holding capacity. Organics in soils, they act like sponges. Organics in a soil act like sponges, and in fact, even a small percent increase in organic matter, even a 1% increase in organic matter, can increase water storage by 16,000 gallons per acre foot in a topsoil. So the benefits of composting, beyond providing moisture to our plants, is that the enriched soil is also going to reduce the amount of stormwater that runs off to our lawns and subsequently, pick up pollutants as it makes its way to our creeks and other waterways. So a few other reasons why a person might want to compost is that composting actually decreases the amount of food and yard waste that's going into landfills. The U.S. EPA estimates that about 30% of municipal solid wastes actually come from food waste and yard trimmings. These wastes, of course, undergo an anaerobic decomposition when they are in landfills. This creates methane, which is a greenhouse gas, and in contrast, in composting systems, the decomposition process is actually aerobic, so it uses oxygen, reducing methane emissions. So by potentially diverting this waste, we could reduce the equivalent of emissions from about 27 million cars a year. That is pretty unbelievable to me. And finally, of course, compost enriches the soil. So this allows us to have more nutrients, water holding capacity, air exchange, and simply in the end, just a better, healthier, happier plant. So in order for us to understand compost and the role that it plays, we need to have a firm understanding about soil composition in general. Minerals are the small rock particles in the soil. These contain various nutrients that are important for plant growth, such as calcium and iron. About 45% of an average soil is actually made up of this mineral matter, and you see that here in the chart. It's the green section in that pie chart. Moving on to air and water, the two blue sections on the left. These spaces are what are between those particles in the soil. These spaces are called pores, and they comprise about 50% of an average soil. So for ideal plant growing conditions, the soil would have about equal amounts of air and water. A dry soil will have mostly air in its pores, while a very wet soil may contain more water than. So for example, sandy soils have larger pores and clayey soils have very small pores. So this makes sense as to why sandy soils would drain much more quickly than a clayey soil, and clay would hold on to water a lot longer. So while minerals are considered inorganic matter, that 45% component of our soil composition, organic matter is anything that is or once was living. So a component of organic is actually still alive. Plant roots and organisms like worms, insects that are consuming and breaking down those organic materials to produce humus are all considered organic, parts of the organic composition of the soil. And although humus makes up a very small percentage of the soil volume, it is critical in the composition of our soil makeup here. And so you can see the breakout here of organic matter. They've broken it down into 3 smaller pieces of the pie. So organic matter overall would comprise about 5%. 10% of that 5% is roots, 10% of that 5% is living organisms like those worms and beetles, etc. And then 80% of that 5% is actual humus, once living things that have been already decomposed. So now let's take a little closer look at the living components of the soil, because it's these components and their feeding relationships that actually really create that healthy soil. What's also really impressive is that these organisms make up only about 1% of soil by volume. It's also these organisms that we rely on in the composting process so heavily. Now, there's lots of lines and crazy curves on this food web slide, but I just wanted you to get a good idea about the bigger picture here. It's not one or two things, it's all these organisms working together, and how obviously the larger animals are feeding on these smaller animals, and it makes a big continuous cycle here. Now let's take a closer look at the living components of soil, because it is these components and their feeding relationships that actually create a healthy soil. So what is also really impressive to me is for us to consider that these organisms make up only 1% of soil by volume. And it's these microorganisms that we rely on to help us carry out the composting process. These 4 million fungi, 10 million actinomycetes, and these 250 million bacteria. And we're going to talk about each of these in a little more depth here in a second. So just to give you a sense of the richness of life in soil, 1 teaspoon of healthy soil contains all of these organisms. So microorganisms such as bacteria, fungus, and actinomyces account for most of the decomposition that takes place in a compost pile. They are considered chemical decomposers because they change the chemistry of organic wastes. There are thousands of different kinds of bacteria at work in a compost pile, but you only need to know the 3 main groups. Saprophiles are cool temperature aerobic bacteria. They do their best work at around 55 degrees Fahrenheit, but will slowly decompose compost even at 0 degrees Fahrenheit. When these bacteria start digesting carbon compounds, some of the energy is given off in the form of heat. The second group are known as mesophiles. These aerobic bacteria do most of the work of decomposition in our compost pile. They thrive at temperatures in the 70 to 90 degree range, and they survive temperatures anywhere between 40 to 110 degrees Fahrenheit. The work of decomposition will continue to raise the temperature inside the pile, even as these mesophiles are doing their jobs. And then our third group are the thermophiles. These are bacteria that work in high temperature ranges from 104 to 200 degrees Fahrenheit, but they prefer temperatures between 105 to 140, so they don't like to go too low or too high. Thermophilic activity quickly raises the temperature in a pile to levels that will kill most weed seeds. So generally 3 to 5 days with a pile temperature of 131 degrees or higher is going to help us manage those weed seeds. And we're going to talk a little more about managing your piles and how to get those temperatures up to those recommended levels. Moving on up the food chain, there are many larger decomposers, or macroorganisms as we call them, in a compost pile. Those could include mites, centipedes, snails, millipedes, slugs, beetles, ants, flies, nematodes, earthworms, and the list goes on and on. They are the ones who are considered to be our physical decomposers because they grind, bite, and suck and tear those organic materials into smaller pieces, which then allow those microbes to do their job more efficiently. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the actual composting. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the composting process in general. We're going to start with the big picture of composting. It's, inputs and outputs. What do we put in? What do we get out? So we're looking at adding in organic matter. Those could be things like plant materials, food waste materials. We also add in air and water, and we get out heat, and of course the end product is our decomposed material or humus. Now let's bring that larger scope down just a little bit, and we'll talk about how those organisms are working and how they feed inside our compost piles. So as you can see from this slide, when all these organisms are being well fed, they can really heat up the pile. And in fact, a well-functioning compost system should have a temperature ranging from like 90 to 140 degrees Fahrenheit. In addition, the pH of your compost will also change over time. Early in the decomposition stage, organic acids are produced, which are favorable for the growth of fungi that break down the tougher plant materials made of lignin and cellulose, say like small sticks and things of that nature. As the composting process continues, the organic acids are neutralized with mature compost, generally having a pH finally between 6 and 8. So that can be pretty variable. The length of time it takes for stable compost to be formed depends on the microbes having prime living conditions, which includes having an infusion of oxygen and the right mix of organics. So now let's talk about, what do those microbes prefer to eat? What is going to keep them healthy and functioning at their highest level? So ideally, they would like a mix of organics that contain a lot of carbon with a modest amount of nitrogen. So an easy way to divide up the carbon-heavy organics from the nitrogen-rich ones is to categorize them into the greens and browns. I know you'll hear that reference to a lot when you are reading through you will hear those two terms referred to quite often when you're reading through, compost resources. So the greens break down easier, and they have more moisture and nutrients, and they are the compost's workforce. The browns contain more energy. They absorb excess moisture, and they give structural strength to the compost pile. They also help keep the pile more porous, facilitating airflow, preventing compaction, and avoiding some of the problems that come along with those situations. So some examples of greens, or those nitrogen-based products, would be things like grass clippings, your leftover food wastes like lettuces, salad stuff, fruit peelings, coffee grounds, weeds, other clippings and yard trimmings and things of that nature. Those would be some of those nitrogen-rich greens that help to break down the carbons. So the browns, that group that provides the carbon ratio to our pile, some examples of those you can see here are wheat straw, dried leaves, hay, any kind of sticks or small branches, paper, cardboard, sawdust, corn stalks, any kind of dried fibrous waste materials would be suitable to add to the pile as a brown. Now remember, they're going to decompose more rapidly if they're in smaller pieces, so you could break up those sticks into much smaller pieces. You could shred up bark. So what should not be compost? So we've talked about some things that we can add, but we haven't really touched on what we shouldn't add. So let's go through some of these and talk about the reasons why they shouldn't be included in our pile. So dairy products, for instance, they can create foul odor problems and attract pests to the pile. All of these actually are going to create odor problems and attract pests. So any kind of dairy product like butter, milk, sour cream, yogurt, and even raw eggs. Fats, grease, lard, or oils, those should not be added to the pile. Meats, like any kind of raw meat, fish bones, seafood scraps, pet wastes, please, let's not put any kind of dog or cat pet waste in our compost pile, because they could carry viruses that are harmful, to humans. Yard trimmings that have been treated with chemical pesticides. So like if you treat your lawn with herbicides, it may not be wise to pick those trimmings up and add those to your pile. Perennial weed roots, definitely don't want to add those because they could take over your pile. Coal or charcoal ash. These may contain substances that are actually harmful to plants, so let's be careful with that. Black walnut tree leaves or twigs, so that could be an issue. Black walnut trees, have a toxin in them that prevents plants that grow underneath their drip line from growing, so that could be an issue. And then, any kind of invasive plant. Although the seed source should be decomposed, as long as you reach those adequate temperatures, you just don't want to take a chance of spreading any of these invasive plants. So just as we talked about earlier, the more surface area that the microbes have to work on, the faster they're going to be able to consume those organic products. So shredding is a very important factor when we are talking about creating prime conditions for our compost pile. So let's make sure that we get the things that we're adding to the pile chopped up pretty small. Like even if you're adding some greens, like say for instance a watermelon rind. A watermelon rind that's cut up into very small pieces is going to decompose much more quickly than a single whole piece of watermelon rind. So let's keep that in mind as we're adding things in. Obviously, water is a key ingredient to a properly functioning compost pile. Too little water in the microbial decomposition process is going to be compromised. Too much and it will slow down or actually completely shut down the process. So organic materials become matted down, nutrients leach out, and low oxygen conditions are created. And as a rule of thumb, we never dump water onto a compost pile. You always want to sprinkle the water gently, over that exposed surface area. The soil should have a content of water that's similar to a wrung out sponge, not a sponge that is soggy that you can squeeze and water comes out. So a third thing we need to keep in mind is oxygen. So the working microbes actually need oxygen because they're aerobic, remember? So to get their jobs done, we need to keep oxygen inside the pile. The materials need to be turned periodically. And when they need to be turned will vary. We'll cover that in a minute. But too much turning can cool the pile down, and too little can actually cause the pile to turn anaerobic, and then our beneficial microbes aren't going to be working at their optimum levels because they need oxygen to function. So under those anaerobic conditions, if that happens, it can create a really bad odor and lower your pH level and just really throw a wrench in the whole process. So typically turning a pile once a week or once every 2 weeks is sufficient. So just keep in mind that more turning does not necessarily accelerate the process, and in some situations it can hinder it. So another thing we need to take into consideration is where are we going to put our compost pile? So a general rule of thumb, again, we don't have to always follow these rules of thumb, but a general rule of thumb is that the compost pile should be 3 by 3 by 3, 3 feet wide, 3 feet in depth, and 3 feet high. It needs to be large enough to retain heat, but small enough so that fresh air, can reach its center and that it's manageable for us to actually turn that pile. We need to think about how much sun it's being exposed to. Partial sun is going to be, the ideal situation. Too much sun could dry your pile out too quickly and cause you to have to water it more. But when you have full shade, this is going to slow down your decomposition process. So a happy medium there with a part sun, part shade situation would be ideal. Make sure that you are close to a water source. We're going to need to be adding water to this pile. If we aren't getting rains on it, we may need to go out there and add some. So make sure that you're putting it somewhere close to a water source. And then finally, we don't want to leave out our neighbors. Let's always keep them in mind. Some homeowners associations may have some rules on compost piles and where they need to be located. So let's always make sure to check with them before we build any kind of permanent structures to house our compost piles. So in general, composting is best done through a general layering approach. You can either follow a very prescriptive approach that creates compost in a shorter period of time, or you can take a less measured approach for a slower compost production. So a slow approach would be to add as you go, okay? So you are saving up all your things that you're gonna add to your pile, your greens and your browns. Like I've got a little jar on my counter that I put lots of my kitchen trash in, and then I've got a junk pile in the yard where I put sticks and dry leaves, and those are kind of my waiting areas, if you will. And so when it gets time to actually add those to the pile, I'm essentially stockpiling my browns and greens so that I can add them at a more practical time. So this is really helpful if you don't have enough initial organic products. You should just go outside and start a compost pile today. You may need to do a little stockpiling before you can get that layering process started. And you can see here in the diagram, we've got some color-coded things here. They've started with some browns, they've came back with a few greens, come back with browns, and then this dark brown line is actually where they have added a layer of soil or manure. So, and the reason that we do this is that the soil actually already has microbes in it. So if you are shoveling some soil out of your garden, layering it into the compost pile, you're essentially adding in some beneficial microbes to kind of help jumpstart things. And then they're just continuing on with the layering process, and then turn about once a week. This would be, you know, a slower process. Just kind of add things as you have them. So if you are managing a cold pile, this is what we would call one of those slower decomposing piles, one that you're not heavily managing, just kind of letting nature do its thing and helping it, but intentionally helping it along a little bit. So for aeration, we're gonna turn it every 2 to 3 days. It could be more, it could be less, depending on how quickly you want that matter to decompose. Add layer of sticks, poking holes in it, and adding your kitchen scraps or your greens down into those holes could be beneficial. And then stirring the pile, not only to aerate, but to help incorporate all of those products, can actually be beneficial for organic breakdown. And then of course, for moisture, we're looking at about 40% water, and we don't want it to feel soggy, just damp. And then if you're not on board for the slow approach and you want to get an end product a little more quickly, you could always go with a more structured plan that is going to help ensure that you get that decomposition in the quickest fashion possible. And so this has very measured amounts of carbon to nitrogen products, just to make sure that you get that ideal combination, that ideal diet and feeding conditions for those microbes to do their job. This is one such recipe, if you will, that is provided by UT Extension. We can find that in a publication at the end of our discussion today if you'd like to look that up and follow some of those more exact recipes for quick composition. So bringing on the heat, I always want to talk about the heat. We do have those 3 specific temperature phases that we talked about earlier, the mesophilic, thermophilic, and then a stabilization area. So decomposition occurs most rapidly between 110 to 160 degrees Fahrenheit. And within 2 weeks, a properly maintained compost pile should reach these temperatures. At this time, you will notice that your pile is settling, which is a good sign that the pile is working properly. Your end product is going to be much less in volume than what you started with, of course. The finished material will also be like a coarse, crumbly, and almost like spongy type of consistency that's perfect for absorbing water and releasing nutrients in the soil. So our tip phases are mesophilic. This is when the pile is rising to 104 degrees. This will last about 2 to 3 days. Then we move into the thermophilic stage. That's 104 to 170. And this phase could last up to 2 months, depending on how you've managed your pile, your ratio of carbons to nitrogens, how often you're turning it, how moist you're keeping it. And this is also the time when most of the decomposition occurs. So most disease pathogens die at temperatures that are around 130, and that temperature needs to be maintained for at least 50 minutes. That's going to be hard for us to monitor, but if you're going out there every couple days and measuring the temperature of your pile, and you're getting readings of above 130, you can be pretty sure that those diseases have been denatured. Aerobic decomposers die at temperatures that are above 140 degrees. Aerobic decomposers are our friends. And then seeds die at temperatures that are above 160 degrees. So after we go through that thermophilic stage, we move on to stabilization. And this is where those temperatures begin to level off, and they will not continue to rise after you turn that pile. So generally you would go out, you turn a pile, you measure it the next day, and the temperature would likely have risen. When you get into stabilization, you know that you're there because you turn the pile. The next day, that temperature has not risen. And in reality, let's be honest, it's really difficult to manage home compost piles that result in the death of weed seeds and pathogens, just because, not most people aren't going out there daily and measuring their pile and doing those turnings and water additions in order to get those temperatures up to those very, very high levels of 140 to 160 degrees Fahrenheit. And that's okay. So if we are trying to manage a quote unquote hot pile, or a pile that we are trying to get up to those higher temperatures to denature disease and weed seeds, the three things that we need to focus on are aeration, temperature, and moisture. So aeration is going to be achieved through obviously turning the pile, poking the pile. You don't have to turn it every day. You can just go out and poke some aeration holes down into the bottom of it. You can also layer sticks at the bottom of your compost pile. And this is going to allow air to access the bottom of the pile. Excuse me. When we're monitoring the temperatures, keep in mind that the temperatures are going to spike, then they'll begin to drop, and then finally level off around 100 degrees Fahrenheit. And we're going to continue turning the pile until our temperatures no longer increase after turning. And sometimes simple is better. This is the approach that I usually take. I've got a big pile of sticks and leaves out here, and I go throw my kitchen scraps in there every couple days. There is no big master plan involved. I turn it very seldom, maybe once a month on accident, or maybe I just, ram it with the four-wheeler and kind of shake it up a little bit. But Mother Nature always gets the job done. And it, of course, it takes a little longer, but in the end, I still get compost. So some of the final steps of creating our compost is sifting, and this just depends on how fine of a product that you want for your final product. So you could use a screen to kind of sift through this compost, and the larger materials that are caught, you could add those back into your compost pile and let them continue to break down, or you may prefer the end product to be a little more coarse and have a little more substance to it. And so that's kind of a personal preference. Oftentimes I get a lot of questions about people who are having issues with their compost pile. They're, have a bad odor, the varmints are getting in it, their pile isn't, it's not shrinking, so they're not sure what they're doing wrong. If your pile isn't progressively getting smaller, it means there's no composition or very little composition happening. So we've got a really good handout that can help you work through some of those troubleshooting issues, talks about the problems, describes what the situation is, tells you what a probable cause of that situation may be, and then also gives you great solutions. And I have that posted at the end of this session as well. So for me, if you're like me, I'm a lazy gardener. I use the pile method here on the left. There's which system is right for you, you know, so that's a good question. If you live out in the country like me, you might just want to be a lazy gardener and use this pile method, and I just go out there and throw stuff in that pile every once in a while. You may want something a little more structured just to keep, you know, pets and, you know, other animals and things from getting into your compost piles. There's all kinds of different homemade structures out there. I've seen them made with pellets and bales of wheat straw, which is kind of cool because then the wheat straw itself breaks down and decomposes and is turned into the compost pile. So the whole thing there is really embracing the reuse, recycle concept. And then there are closed structures, of course, that you can buy, or I've even seen people make these out of big plastic trash cans. So this could be really handy, you know, kitchen composters, something that you keep right by the back door. It has a lid, you don't have to smell it. That could be a neat product for some. So lots of different things to take into consideration when you're trying to decide what type of compost bin would be right for you. Here's some examples of those bins that are made with pallets. You could make that a 3-bin system. That could help you with turning. You could just shovel it out of the first bin into the second bin, so on and so forth, while you're always continuously starting a brand new pile, you know, in the far left bin. So that's kind of a neat way to manage your pile. You can also, I've seen homemade bins made with wire mesh, concrete blocks even. And then there's a good old trash can. There are many commercial composters on the market. Some can get pretty pricey. And again, that's just up to you, depending on what your situation is and which one of these would be easiest for you to manage. I know there are some folks who don't have the back power to be shoveling and turning those large piles, and these tumbler style composters may be a better way for you to go. So we've wrapped up our inch on composting. We could have made it 3 inches, but it was just our first inch. So we've wrapped up composting. We're going to move on to the rest of our inching towards success with Genesee Smart Yards. So now we're going to move on to our second inch in our Reduce, Reuse, Recycle module, and that is focusing on reusing landscape waste right there on site. So as we discussed earlier, Mother Nature has already instituted her own process of decomposition and mulching by the shedding of leaves and needles, etc., in wooded areas. And you see the fallen leaves that have fallen on the ground and just lying there through the winter and following months. They are beginning to be decomposed by those soil microbes and essentially providing a natural mulch right there on that understory floor. So letting our leaves remain around our trees and letting them self-mulch is actually a really great way to use your leaves and add organics to those soils, which are many times kind of compacted and bare underneath the trees because there's not a lot of vegetation growing in those areas. So those leaves and mulch actually can provide lots of benefits for us. Our next inch, we're going to talk about recycling grass clippings and leaving them on the lawn. I know a lot of people like to, you know, mow their yard and then come right back up and sweep those grass clippings up just so they have a really nice, immaculately manicured lawn. But leaving your grass clippings is actually really important part of the nutrient recycling in our soil. So grass cycling is what we like to call this, is a simple method for recycling your yard waste. And you can add valuable nutrients back to your soil, reducing the amount of additional fertilizer your lawn needs, if you even use it at all. So it also reduces the time that you'll have to take on your own lawn. You know, obviously bagging and hauling them away, you won't have to do that. One study showed that by not bagging clippings, mowing took 38% less time, and I'm all for shorter mowing times. So a few other points that I want to mention about leaving our grass clippings is that, contrary to popular belief, grass clippings are not the major cause of thatch in residential turfs. Thatch is actually a layer of both live and decaying organic material, including roots, above and below ground stems, leaves and roots, not just mown grass blades. Grass roots contain lignin, a substance that decomposes very slowly and actually causes thatch. So grass clippings are about 90% water, so they decompose very quickly. If you do leave your grass clippings in place, you will want to be sure to cut them small enough to filter through the turf grass canopy and get all the way down into the soil region, which is where decomposition happens. Once this occurs, the clippings can decompose and become part of the turf soil nutrient cycle. Thus, your mowing approach is important. We need to mow when your grass needs it, not on a strict mowing schedule. A guide would be to mow only 1/3. A best management practice is to only mow 1/3 of the leaf blade height off at any one given mowing session. Dull blades tear turf grasses, and this can cause disease and weaken the plant and leaves a ragged appearance to the lawn. And mowing in wet conditions actually mat the clippings down, and they don't allow them to filter down into the soil where they would begin decomposition. And then in those types of situations, they are contributing to thatch. And then our final inch is talking about incorporating salvaged materials into the landscape. And this is where we can really implement that reuse and recycle concept. So a few practical practices would be to utilize cardboard and newspapers and things like that that we already have on hand in our vegetable gardens, and we could even use them in our ornamental gardens to help reduce weeds. If we block out the sunlight, we greatly reduce the number of weed seeds that are able to germinate. This is another neat idea where they took sticks off of their property and basically weaved them in and out between these upright stakes, and they've created a really, really nice privacy fence there. Now I wanted to share with you some pictures from the UT Gardens in Jackson. Jason Reeves sent me these pictures. He does a great job of getting really creative in the garden and reusing materials that he has on hand to create a really neat, interesting, and playful atmosphere in the gardens. So here's an example where they had some winged elms that had died in a fence row, and they just actually chopped them off at the base and then cemented them into buckets at the bottom, and then they sunk those buckets down into the ground as an anchor, and they've painted them these really vibrant colors that really catch the eye and complement lots of the plants, especially annuals, flowering annuals that they have in the berms out at the research center. This is a cool picture. We have a recycled bottle wall that's been constructed, and it is, it's the center of attention. It's focal point for the entire garden, and it's beautiful, and the colors shine all season. And here you can see they've taken some old washers and just things that they had laying around the shop. I think they made the dragon's wings here out of utensil handles and have made some really neat lawn garden art. Some other examples of reuse: if you've got some old chairs or tables sitting out somewhere and you're not sure what to do with them, hey, you can turn those babies into planters. Just turn them upside down, and I think we added burlap here, stapled it to the bottom, and added some plants here that do really well with small amounts of soil. So we've got some sedums and other low-growing items growing here, and that would be a really neat, fun way to incorporate some reusable products in the garden. And then this one was really fun. He just stuck a whole kitchen out there. This is part of the recreation of his kitchen garden that he did several years ago. And you can see here they've used lots of different cooking containers to actually serve as planters. So here's a muffin tin. We've got, I think this is a bundt pan there on the bottom of the stove door that's open. We've got a cake pan up on top of the stove. There's even an iron skillet. So these are all really interesting, unique, fun ways to add a little whimsy to the garden. And let's always be sure, if we're recycling some of these old containers, we need to make sure there's drainage holes. There's not going to be holes in them already. So that's something we'll need to add before we get those planted up and added to the garden. Then our final slide for fun reusable ideas for the garden is this tower of discs. Jason found these old discs at, I believe, a junkyard somewhere, and had the great idea to just attach them alternately to this very, very tall pole. And each year he lets different combinations of vines, annual vines, climb up that eye-catching garden structure, and it is really beautiful. So these are just a few ideas of how you can turn one man's trash into another person's treasure. So I hope you've enjoyed our talk today and learned quite a bit about compost and how to approach that if that's something that you want to start doing, and some of the other steps that we can take in our own landscapes to reuse, reduce, and recycle.